The crash of splintering wood echoed through Murphy's saloon as the chair legs snapped clean in two against the wall. Tobias Crane stood over the wreckage, his massive frame casting shadows across the sawdust floor like storm clouds over prairie grass. At 6'4" and built like a draft horse, he commanded the room through sheer presence and the promise of violence that hung around him like smoke from a dying fire. 3 of his men flanked him at the bar, their spurs jangling with each shifting step. They had ridden into Deadwood that morning with dust on their coats and cruelty in their eyes, the kind of men who measured their worth by how much fear they could squeeze from decent folk. Crane's lieutenant, a wiry snake of a man called Pike, spat tobacco juice into the brass spittoon and missed deliberately, leaving a brown stain on the polished wood. Martha Hendricks moved between the tables like a sparrow trying to avoid hawks, her weathered hands trembling as she collected empty glasses. At 63, she had worked in Murphy's for the better part of 2 decades, serving whiskey to miners and cowboys with equal kindness. Her gray hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her brown dress, though clean and mended, showed the wear of honest work. The lines around her green eyes spoke of laughter shared and sorrows witnessed, but tonight those eyes held only fear. Crane reached out as she passed, his thick fingers wrapping around her wrist like iron shackles. "You move like molasses, old woman," he said, his voice carrying the rough edge of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Bring us another bottle of your finest, and mind you don't spill it like last time." "There was no last time," Martha replied quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "This is the first time you gentlemen have visited our establishment." The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Even the piano player had slipped out through the back door when Crane's gang had bellied up to the bar. The few remaining patrons pressed themselves against the far walls, nursing their drinks and avoiding eye contact. Before we continue with this tale of the Old West, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Comment below and tell me what state or country you're in. These stories of frontier justice travel far and wide, and it always amazes me to see how the spirit of the American West reaches people everywhere. Now, let's see what happens when this old cowboy decides he's heard enough. Pike laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Gentlemen," he says. "You hear that, boys? We're gentlemen now." In the corner booth nearest the window, a lone figure sat hunched over a glass of whiskey, his presence so unremarkable that Crane's eyes had passed over him a dozen times without truly seeing. The man appeared to be in his late 60s, maybe 70, with silver hair that caught the lamplight and a beard the color of winter frost. His clothes were simple, a worn brown shirt and dark trousers that had seen better days. Wire-rimmed spectacles perched on his nose, and his hands, wrapped around his glass, showed the deep lines and liver spots of advanced age. What caught attention, though few bothered to look closely, were his eyes. Pale blue, like ice on a mountain lake, they watched everything while seeming to focus on nothing. They were eyes that had seen too much, remembered too much, and carried the weight of decisions no man should have to make. Crane jerked Martha closer, and she stumbled, catching herself against a nearby table. The old man in the corner shifted slightly, his fingers tightening almost imperceptibly around his glass. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," the old man said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the saloon. "The lady asked you to stop." Crane's head turned slowly, his attention finally focusing on the insignificant figure in the corner. His mouth curved into a grin that held no warmth, like a wolf baring its teeth. "Did someone say something? I thought I heard a mouse squeaking." Pike and the others laughed on cue, but their laughter died quickly when they saw the old man stand. He moved carefully, like someone whose bones ached with the memory of hard years, and placed a coin on the table to pay for his drink. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, the actions of a man who had all the time in the world. The saloon's atmosphere grew heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, marking off the seconds with mechanical precision. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending dust devils dancing down the main street of Deadwood. "Son," Crane said, releasing Martha's wrist and turning his full attention to the old man, "you look like you might blow away in a strong wind. Why don't you finish your drink and head on home before you get hurt?" The old man adjusted his spectacles with one finger, a gesture so mild and ordinary that it might have been comical under different circumstances. "I believe I've had enough for tonight," he replied. "But the lady hasn't finished her work, and you gentlemen are making it difficult for her to complete her duties." Martha backed away slowly, her hand pressed to her throat, watching this unexpected defender with a mixture of hope and terror. She had seen too many good men die trying to stand up to bullies like Crane, men who confused courage with stupidity and paid the ultimate price for their noble intentions. Crane took a step forward, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. The old man didn't retreat. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his pale eyes fixed on Crane's face with the kind of attention a scholar might pay to an interesting book. "You threatening us, Grandpa?" Pike asked, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his pistol. The old man shook his head slowly. "I'm not threatening anyone. I'm simply suggesting that you allow the lady to finish her work in peace." The tension in the room stretched taut as a bowstring. In the corner, the grandfather clock continued its steady marking of time, each tick a heartbeat closer to violence. The wind outside grew stronger, and somewhere in the distance, a dog began to howl. Crane's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the Black Hills. He had built his reputation on the fear he could inspire in lesser men, on the way they would look away when he entered a room, on the silence that fell when he spoke. This old fool with his wire spectacles and trembling hands was disrupting the natural order of things, challenging the authority that Crane had carved out with his fists and his gun. Martha pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering in her chest like a trapped bird. She had worked in saloons long enough to recognize the signs, the way violence gathered in a room like smoke before it burst into flame. She could see it in the set of Crane's shoulders, in the way Pike's hand had found his weapon, in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the remaining patrons like a burial shroud. The old man stood perfectly straight now, and something had changed in his posture. The frailty seemed to have drained away like water from a broken dam, leaving behind something harder, more substantial. His pale eyes never left Crane's face, and there was a quality to his attention that made the big man shift uncomfortably. "You know what I think, old man?" Crane said, his voice dropping to a growl. "I think you've lived too long if you can't recognize when to keep your mouth shut." He reached for one of the heavy wooden chairs that surrounded the poker table, lifting it with ease despite its substantial weight. The chair was solid oak, built to withstand the rough treatment of miners and cowboys, its surface scarred by years of use and marked with the ring stains of countless whiskey glasses. The old man watched him lift the chair with the same calm attention he had shown throughout the encounter. His breathing remained steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. If he felt fear, it didn't show in his weathered face or pale blue eyes. "Maybe this will help you remember your place," Crane snarled, raising the chair high over his head. The impact, when it came, sounded like thunder in the confined space of the saloon. Wood met flesh and bone with a crack that echoed off the walls, and the old man staggered forward, his spectacles skittering across the floor. For a moment, the only sound was the settling of broken chair pieces and the heavy breathing of the men who had witnessed the assault. Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Pike and the others chuckled, satisfied that their leader had restored the proper order of things. The few remaining customers looked away, ashamed of their inability to intervene, but unwilling to invite the same treatment upon themselves. Then the old man straightened slowly, rolling his shoulders like a man working out a minor kink. Blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where the chair had connected, but his expression remained unchanged. If anything, he seemed more alert than before, more present in the moment. He turned around with deliberate care, his pale eyes finding Crane's face with laser precision. When he spoke, his voice carried no anger, no pain, no fear. Just a quiet certainty that made the temperature in the room seem to drop 10 degrees. "Naomi." The silence that followed those two words stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. Crane stood frozen, the remains of the shattered chair still clutched in his massive hands, trying to process what he had just witnessed. The old man had taken a blow that should have dropped a bull, yet here he stood, blood trickling from his forehead, looking at Crane as if he were nothing more than a mildly interesting insect. "Naomi." The words hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot, quiet and final. There was something in the way the old man said them, a quality that made the hair on the back of Crane's neck stand up despite himself. It wasn't a threat or a boast. It was simply a statement of fact, delivered with the same certainty one might use to predict the sunrise. Pike shifted nervously at the bar, his hand hovering near his pistol but not quite committed to drawing it. Something had changed in the room's atmosphere, though he couldn't put his finger on what. The old man looked the same, still wearing his simple clothes and wire-rimmed spectacles, still appearing frail enough to be knocked over by a strong wind. But there was something different in the way he stood, the way he held his shoulders, the way his pale blue eyes seemed to catalog every person and object in the saloon with military precision. Behind the bar, Deputy Marshal Vernon Blackwood watched the unfolding confrontation with growing unease. At 28, Vernon had worn a badge for 6 years and prided himself on his ability to read dangerous situations. He had been nursing a beer and trying to forget about the stack of wanted posters on his desk when Crane and his gang had rolled into town. Now something about the old man was triggering memories he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a half-forgotten dream. Crane's face flushed red as his initial shock transformed into rage. No one, especially not some decrepit old fool, challenged Tobias Crane and lived to tell about it. He had killed men for less than this, carved his reputation out of the bones of those who had underestimated his capacity for violence. "You want to play, Grandpa?" Crane snarled, tossing aside the broken chair pieces. "Let's play." He lunged forward with surprising speed for such a large man, his ham-sized fist aimed at the old man's jaw. It should have connected with bone-crushing force, should have dropped the stranger to the sawdust floor in an unconscious heap. Instead, the old man moved with fluid grace that defied his apparent age, stepping aside at the last possible moment and allowing Crane's momentum to carry him past. Crane stumbled, caught off balance by the unexpected miss, and turned to find the old man standing exactly where he had been before, hands still relaxed at his sides. There was no smug satisfaction on his weathered face, no hint of triumph or mockery, just that same calm attention, as if he were watching a mildly interesting theater performance. The big man's face darkened further. "Lucky dodge, old-timer. Let's see you do it again." This time Crane approached more carefully, his massive frame moving with the deliberate intent of a predator stalking prey. He grabbed a whiskey bottle from the nearest table and hurled it at the old man's head with vicious force. The bottle should have shattered against skull and brain, should have ended this ridiculous confrontation in a spray of blood and broken glass. Instead, the old man tilted his head slightly to the right, and the bottle sailed past his ear to explode against the wall in a shower of amber liquid and crystal fragments. He hadn't flinched, hadn't ducked or thrown himself to the ground. Just a small adjustment of position that made the difference between life and death. Martha pressed herself deeper into the corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. She had seen bar fights before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. The old man moved like water, flowing around Crane's attacks without apparent effort, never striking back, but never quite allowing himself to be struck. Vernon found himself leaning forward, his memory working furiously to place where he had seen movement like that before. There was something familiar about the old man's stance, the way he balanced his weight on the balls of his feet, the way his eyes tracked every motion in the room while maintaining focus on the primary threat. It reminded him of something, someone, but the memory remained frustratingly out of reach. Crane roared in frustration and grabbed the heavy oak table where the old man had been sitting, lifting it over his head with brute strength. Whiskey glasses crashed to the floor, and the sound of splintering wood filled the air as he prepared to bring 200 pounds of furniture down on his target's skull. "That's enough," the old man said quietly. For the first time, there was something different in his voice. The polite, grandfatherly tone had shifted into something harder, colder. It carried the ring of absolute authority, the sound of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Crane hesitated, the table still raised over his head, caught off guard by the change. In that moment of uncertainty, the old man took a single step forward. Just one step, but something about it made everyone in the saloon take an involuntary breath. His posture had changed completely. The stooped shoulders had straightened into a military bearing that spoke of years spent in command. The tremor in his hands had vanished. replaced by the steady control of someone who had held life and death in his palms and never wavered. Most striking of all, his pale blue eyes had gone flat and cold as winter ice, the kind of eyes that had looked into the face of death so many times they no longer recognized it as a stranger. "Put it down," the old man said, and this time his voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. Vernon's breath caught in his throat as recognition finally dawned. The stance, the voice, the way the old man had moved during the fight, all of it clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle he had been trying to solve for years. His hand moved instinctively to the stack of wanted posters in his jacket pocket, though he already knew what he would find there. "Sweet Jesus," he whispered, so quietly that only he could hear it. The old man's transformation was complete now, the mask of frailty discarded like an old coat. He stood with the bearing of someone who had commanded respect through decades of violence and authority, someone who had faced down killers and walked away when lesser men had been carried out in pine boxes. Pike noticed the change too, his earlier confidence evaporating like morning mist. This wasn't the harmless old fool they had been tormenting. This was something else entirely, something that made his survival instincts scream warnings he couldn't ignore. "Boss," Pike said nervously, his voice cracking slightly. "Maybe we should just move on." Crane's face was purple with rage, but even he could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the room's dynamic. The table felt heavier in his hands now, and the old man's unwavering stare seemed to be looking right through him, cataloging his weaknesses and measuring him for a grave. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its relentless ticking, marking off the seconds until violence would explode through the saloon like a dynamite blast. Outside, storm clouds gathered over the Black Hills, and the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the windows. In the growing darkness, Deputy Marshal Vernon Blackwood reached slowly for his jacket pocket, his mind racing as he tried to remember exactly how many men the legendary figure standing before them was supposed to have killed. The old man's eyes found Vernon's across the room, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding, the weight of shared knowledge that would change everything in the next few heartbeats. "Son," the old man said to Crane, his voice now carrying the authority of someone who had worn a badge when law was something you enforced with lead and prayer, "you're holding that table like you mean to use it. I'm going to give you one chance to set it down and walk out of here with all your parts still attached to your body." Crane's grip tightened on the table, his knuckles white with strain. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to retreat, to gather his men and leave this cursed saloon behind. But pride and reputation held him frozen in place like a fly trapped in amber. He had built his fearsome image on never backing down, never showing weakness, never allowing anyone to challenge his authority without paying in blood. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows with increasing urgency. Lightning flickered in the distance, and thunder rolled across the prairie like the sound of approaching cavalry. The storm that had been building all evening was finally breaking over Deadwood, and the same could be said for the tension inside Murphy's saloon. Martha watched from her corner, hardly daring to breathe. She had lived through the wild years when Deadwood was nothing more than a collection of tents and rough-board shacks, when justice came from the barrel of a gun and graveyards filled faster than churches could be built. She recognized the signs of impending violence. The way the air itself seemed to thicken before men started dying. Pike and the other gang members shifted nervously, their earlier bravado crumbling in the face of something they couldn't understand but instinctively feared. The old man hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't made any threatening moves, but something about his presence had transformed the saloon into a place where death waited with patient hunger. "Your choice," the old man said quietly, and those two words carried more menace than all of Crane's roaring and posturing combined. Vernon's fingers found the wanted poster he was looking for, the one he had memorized years ago during his training. The sketch was old, drawn by an artist who had worked from second-hand descriptions, but the eyes were unmistakable. Pale blue, like chips of winter ice, eyes that had looked into the face of violence and never flinched. The poster bore a name that every lawman west of the Mississippi knew by heart, along with a number that made grown men cross themselves and pray they never encountered its owner in a dark alley or dusty street. 47 confirmed kills. All justified. All necessary. all delivered with the cold precision of a man who understood that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to eliminate the guilty with extreme prejudice. Thunder crashed overhead as Crane's control finally snapped. With a roar of rage that shook the windows, he brought the heavy table down with every ounce of his considerable strength, putting behind it all his fury and frustration and wounded pride. The table struck the floor where the old man had been standing, exploding into kindling and sawdust with a sound like a cannon shot. But the target was no longer there. The old man had moved with liquid grace, sliding aside at the last possible instant, and now he stood behind Crane with his hand resting lightly on the big man's shoulder. "Hello, Tobias," he said conversationally, as if greeting an old friend at a church social. "I believe we have some business to discuss." Crane spun around with the desperate speed of a cornered animal, his massive frame twisting despite its bulk as he tried to face this impossible threat that had materialized behind him like smoke. His face had gone pale beneath the permanent sunburn of a lifetime spent outdoors, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air flowing through the saloon's broken windows. The old man stood perfectly still, his hand no longer resting on Crane's shoulder, but hanging loose at his side. The transformation that had begun during their confrontation was now complete, and what remained bore little resemblance to the frail grandfather who had been nursing whiskey in the corner booth. His shoulders were square and military straight, his pale blue eyes sharp as winter starlight, and his entire bearing spoke of authority earned through decades of violence and command. Deputy Vernon Blackwood felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins as the final pieces of recognition clicked into place. His hand trembled as he pulled the wanted poster from his jacket pocket, though he no longer needed to verify what his memory had already confirmed. The sketch was crude, drawn by an artist working from second-hand descriptions, but the eyes were unmistakable. "Sweet Jesus," Vernon whispered, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain on the roof. "That's Jake Morrison. Winter Morrison." The name hit the saloon like a physical blow, draining the color from every face and turning bold men into frightened children. Even Pike, who prided himself on his reputation as a dangerous man, felt his knees go weak as the implications sank in. Everyone west of the Mississippi knew the name, knew the stories, knew the number that followed him like a shadow cast by the setting sun. Jake Morrison, federal marshal for 30 years. 47 confirmed kills. The winter ghost of the frontier, they called him, because he could track a man across snow without leaving footprints and put a bullet through a silver dollar at 100 paces on the coldest day of the year. Men who faced him in the street said his pale blue eyes were the last thing they saw before the darkness claimed them. "You're lying," Crane said, but his voice lacked conviction. It came out as more of a plea than a statement, the desperate denial of a man who suddenly found himself staring into the abyss. "Jake Morrison is dead. Has been for years." The old man, no longer old in any meaningful sense, smiled without warmth. "Reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated, Tobias. Though I can understand the confusion. I retired 10 years ago after my wife Sarah passed, hung up my badge, and tried to disappear into peaceful obscurity." His voice carried the weight of absolute certainty, the tone of a man who had never needed to prove himself because his reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. As he spoke, his hands moved with practiced ease to his gun belt, pushing aside the long coat that had concealed twin holsters worn low on his hips. The leather was black with age and worn smooth by decades of use. The holsters themselves were custom work, designed for someone who drew his weapons not for show, but for the deadly serious business of ending human lives with surgical precision. And nestled in those holsters were the legendary Colt peacemakers that had become as much a part of Jake Morrison's identity as his pale blue eyes. The revolvers were works of art and instruments of death in equal measure. The barrels gleamed with careful maintenance, and the grips bore intricate carving that caught the lamplight. But it was the initials carved into each grip that made Vernon's breath catch in his throat. S.M. Sarah Morrison, the woman whose death had driven the most feared lawman in the territories into retirement, and whose memory still guided his hand when justice needed to be dispensed. Pike backed toward the door, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. "Boss," he said urgently, his voice cracking with barely controlled panic. "We need to go. Right now?" Crane's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of a man who had just realized he was standing on his own grave. The stories about Jake Morrison weren't the usual frontier exaggerations that grew with each telling. They were documented fact, verified by federal marshals and territorial governors, recorded in official reports that gathered dust in government offices from Kansas City to Sacramento. The Clearwater Massacre, where Morrison had tracked 5 escaped convicts through a blizzard and brought them back draped over their horses. The Silvertown Standoff, where he had faced down 8 armed men in the middle of Main Street and walked away without a scratch while the Undertaker worked overtime. The Red River Incident, where a gang of 23 outlaws had learned too late that numbers meant nothing when facing someone who could place a bullet exactly where he intended it to go. "You can't be him," Crane said desperately, grasping for any thread of hope. "Morrison would be 70 years old by now. You're just some old fool with delusions." 68. Jake corrected mildly, as if discussing the weather. "And I've been trying to enjoy a quiet retirement in the mountains of Colorado, raising horses and reading books and pretending that the past was just a bad dream. But then men like you remind me that evil doesn't retire just because good men grow tired of fighting it." The rain outside intensified, sheets of water cascading down the windows and turning the street into a river of mud. Lightning illuminated the saloon in stark black and white, and thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire from some distant battlefield. Martha pressed herself against the wall, hardly daring to breathe as she witnessed history unfolding before her eyes. She had heard the stories, of course, whispered around campfires and told in hushed voices in saloons from Montana to Arizona. Jake Morrison, the man who cleaned up Dodge City when decent folk couldn't walk the streets after dark. Jake Morrison, who brought law to Tombstone when it was nothing but a collection of tents and gambling halls. Jake Morrison, whose very name could clear a room of troublemakers faster than a fire bell. But seeing the legend in person was something else entirely. This wasn't the larger-than-life figure of frontier mythology. This was a tired old man who had watched too many people die, killed too many people himself, and carried the weight of necessary violence like stones in his pockets. Yet when duty called, when innocent people needed protection, he could still become the instrument of justice that had made him famous throughout the territories. Crane's gang continued backing toward the door, their earlier confidence shattered by the revelation of who they were facing. These were hard men, killers and thieves who had survived by being meaner and faster than their competition. But Jake Morrison represented something beyond their understanding, a level of skill and reputation that made their own accomplishments seem like child's play. "You boys might want to step outside," Jake suggested conversationally, his pale blue eyes never leaving Crane's face. "What happens next isn't going to be pleasant to watch, and I'd hate for you to have nightmares." Pike needed no further encouragement. He bolted for the door like a rabbit fleeing a forest fire, followed closely by the other gang members. Within moments, only Crane remained, standing alone in the center of the saloon like a man facing his own execution. The grandfather clock in the corner continued its relentless ticking, marking off the seconds until violence would explode through the room like a thunderclap. Outside, the storm reached its full fury, lashing deadwood with wind and rain that rattled windows and stripped leaves from trees. Jake Morrison stood perfectly still in the center of Murphy's saloon, his pale blue eyes conducting a tactical assessment that had become as natural as breathing during 3 decades of federal law enforcement. The room measured roughly 40 feet by 30, with 3 exits including the main entrance, the back door that led to the alley, and a side door that connected to the hotel next door. 7 tables provided cover or obstacles depending on positioning. The bar itself offered concealment, but could become a trap if approached incorrectly. 2 coal oil lamps provided illumination, casting shifting shadows that could be used for concealment or misdirection. The large mirror behind the bar would allow him to monitor movement without turning his back on primary threats. Most importantly, Martha Hendricks remained pressed against the far wall, well clear of any potential crossfire, but close enough that her safety had to factor into every decision he made. Crane stood 15 feet away, his massive frame trembling with a combination of rage and barely controlled fear. The big man's hand hovered near his sidearm, a well-maintained Colt that showed signs of regular use, but lacked the practiced wear patterns that indicated real expertise. His stance was all wrong for a fast draw, weight distributed like a brawler rather than a gunfighter, and his eyes kept darting toward the door where his men had fled. Outside, Jake could hear boots on wooden planks and urgent whispered conversations. Pike and the others hadn't run far, probably gathering their courage and trying to decide whether loyalty to their boss outweighed their terror of facing a living legend. In Jake's experience, greed and fear made for unpredictable combinations, and he couldn't count on them staying away much longer. 30 years of hunting dangerous men had taught him to read situations like other people read newspapers. Crane was the primary threat, but his desperation made him dangerous in unpredictable ways. The gang members outside represented unknown variables that could complicate the situation if they found their courage. Most importantly, innocent lives hung in the balance, and that consideration always took precedence over personal safety or tactical advantage. The grandfather clock ticked toward 10:30, its steady rhythm marking time like a funeral drum. Rain continued to hammer the roof and windows, and lightning flickered through the storm clouds with increasing frequency. The weather would mask the sound of gunfire and provide cover for anyone trying to move around the building's exterior. "You know, Tobias," Jake said conversationally, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone discussing crop prices rather than imminent violence. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier. About me being too old for this kind of work." Crane's face flushed red despite his fear, pride warring with survival instinct in a battle that had already determined his fate. "You are too old," he snarled, his voice cracking slightly. "Whatever you used to be, you're nothing now but memories and ghost stories." The saloon's front door creaked open, and Pike's weaselly face appeared in the gap like a cautious rodent testing for predators. Behind him, Jake could make out at least two other figures, their weapons drawn but held low as they tried to work up the nerve to support their leader. Jake's internal calculator adjusted for the new variables without conscious thought. Multiple armed opponents, confined space, innocent bystander requiring protection. The solution presented itself with mathematical certainty, a problem he had solved dozens of times across 3 decades of federal service. "Ghost stories," Jake repeated, and something in his tone made Crane take an involuntary step backward. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I am just a collection of old tales told around campfires and in barrooms. But the thing about ghosts, Tobias, is that they tend to be very bad for the health of people who don't believe in them." Pike pushed through the door with his revolver half-raised, clearly hoping to catch the legendary Marshal off guard. It was exactly the kind of amateur mistake that Jake had been expecting, the desperate gambit of men who confused violence with competence. Jake moved without seeming to hurry, his motion as fluid and inevitable as water flowing downhill. His left hand swept out in a casual gesture that connected with Pike's wrist at precisely the right angle and with exactly the right amount of force. The revolver flew from Pike's fingers to clatter across the floor like a child's toy, and Pike himself stumbled backward into the doorframe with a yelp of pain and surprise. The movement had taken less than 2 seconds and appeared almost accidental to anyone who didn't understand the biomechanics of joint manipulation and nerve strikes. Jake had learned those techniques from an old Chinese man in San Francisco, refined them through years of practice, and applied them in situations where killing wasn't necessary but disarmament was essential. "That was remarkably clumsy of you," Jake observed mildly, as if commenting on someone dropping their hat. "Perhaps you should be more careful where you point that thing." Pike cradled his numbed wrist and stared at Jake with the wide-eyed terror of a man who had just witnessed something that violated his understanding of how the world worked. The legendary Marshal hadn't drawn his weapons, hadn't even appeared to exert himself, yet Pike's gun hand felt like it had been struck by lightning. 2 more gang members pushed through the door behind Pike, their weapons raised and ready for violence. Jake evaluated them with the same clinical detachment a doctor might use to examine symptoms. The first was young, maybe 25, with the quick, nervous movements of someone accustomed to relying on speed rather than skill. His Colt was clean but showed little wear, suggesting limited real experience in gunfights. The second was older, closer to 40, with the steady hands and careful stance of someone who had survived multiple encounters with armed opponents. His revolver was worn smooth in all the right places, and his eyes tracked Jake's movement with professional attention. This one would require more careful handling. Jake's right hand moved to rest casually on his gun belt, not quite touching either of the legendary peacemakers, but close enough to remind everyone present exactly who they were dealing with. The gesture was small, almost casual, but it had the effect of a loaded cannon being rolled into position. "Gentlemen," he said, his pale blue eyes moving from one face to another with the precision of a surveyor mapping territory. "I believe there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of this situation. You seem to think this is a negotiation. It's not." The young gunman's nerve broke first. He raised his weapon with the desperate speed of panic, trying to put a bullet into Jake before the legendary marshal could draw his own guns. It was a mistake that countless other young men had made over the years, the fatal assumption that speed could substitute for skill and experience. Jake's response was poetry written in gunpowder and lead. His right hand peacemaker cleared leather with liquid grace, the movement so smooth and practiced that it seemed almost leisurely despite its blazing speed. The hammer fell with mechanical precision, and the young gunman's weapon exploded in a shower of metal fragments that left him staring at the mangled remains of his gun while blood dripped from superficial wounds on his hand. The shot echoed through the saloon like thunder, but Jake was already moving, his body flowing with the deadly grace of someone who had turned violence into an art form. The older gunman was bringing his own weapon to bear with professional competence, his movements steady and deliberate, but Jake had been anticipating this exact scenario since the moment the man had entered the room. The legendary marshal's left-hand peacemaker appeared in his grip as if conjured by magic, and two shots rang out in such rapid succession that they seemed like echoes of the same gunshot. The older gunman's revolver flew from his hands, and he stumbled backward with a cry of pain as Jake's bullet creased his shoulder without doing permanent damage. In the space of 5 seconds, 3 armed men had been neutralized without a single fatality. It was the kind of precision shooting that made Jake Morrison a legend among lawmen and outlaws alike. The demonstration of skills honed through decades of practice and refined in the crucible of life-and-death encounters. Martha watched from her corner with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by relief and terror in equal measure. She had witnessed something that few people ever saw. The moment when legend became reality and stories told around campfires revealed themselves to be pale shadows of the truth. Deputy Vernon Blackwood stood frozen behind the bar, his hand still resting on his own weapon, but making no move to draw it. This was Jake Morrison at work, and interfering would be like trying to direct a thunderstorm or give advice to an earthquake. The saloon filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of burned powder, but Jake's expression remained as calm as if he were discussing the weather. His pale blue eyes found Crane's face across the room, and something passed between them that needed no words to communicate its meaning. "Now then, Tobias," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the ringing aftermath of gunfire. "I believe we were discussing the difference between reputation and reality. Would you care to continue that conversation?" Crane stared at the scene of devastation around him, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. 3 of his men had been neutralized in the space of a few heartbeats by an opponent who appeared to be moving at normal speed, yet somehow stayed ahead of their desperate attempts at violence. The legendary marshal's weapons were already holstered again, the movements so fluid that Crane hadn't even seen them return to leather. The wounded gang members began retreating toward the door, cradling injured hands and shoulders while shooting terrified glances over their shoulders. Pike had already vanished into the storm, his nerve completely broken by his encounter with skills that belonged in dime novels rather than reality. "This isn't possible," Crane whispered, his voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "You're just one man. One old man." Jake began walking slowly across the saloon floor, stepping over broken glass and splintered wood with the careful attention of someone navigating a familiar battlefield. His pale blue eyes never left Crane's face, and his expression remained as calm and professional as a banker discussing loan terms. "Muscle memory is a remarkable thing, Tobias," Jake said conversationally, as if sharing an interesting observation about the weather. 30 years of daily practice creates pathways in the brain and nervous system that never completely fade. Draw, aim, fire, reload. 10,000 repetitions until the movements become as natural as breathing. As he spoke, Jake's mind drifted back through decades of similar confrontations. The mining camp outside Denver where he had faced 6 claim jumpers armed with rifles and shotguns. The railroad town in Wyoming where corrupt officials had hired 15 gunmen to eliminate an inconvenient federal marshal. The border crossing near El Paso where Mexican revolutionaries had learned too late that political causes meant nothing to bullets fired with surgical precision. Each encounter had taught him something new about violence and survival, about the thin line between justice and vengeance, about the weight that accumulated in a man's soul when he made a career out of ending other people's lives. He had tried to leave that weight behind when he hung up his badge, tried to find peace in the mountains of Colorado with his horses and his books and the memory of Sarah's laughter. But men like Crane made peace impossible. They preyed on the innocent and the vulnerable, spreading fear and suffering like a disease that infected entire communities. Someone had to stand against them. And if that someone happened to be a tired old man who just wanted to be left alone, well, duty didn't ask permission before making its demands. The thing about reputation, Jake continued, still walking slowly toward Crane across the debris-strewn floor, is that it's built on results. Every man I've killed was given a choice. Walk away or face the consequences. Some chose wisdom. Others chose pride. The graveyards are full of men who confused pride with courage. Crane's hand moved toward his gun, then stopped, then moved again in a trembling display of indecision that spoke volumes about his mental state. He had built his entire identity around being the biggest, meanest, most dangerous man in any room he entered. Now he found himself facing someone who rendered size and meanness irrelevant, someone whose reputation was built on skills rather than intimidation. "You killed 47 men," Crane said, his voice cracking with strain. 47. That's not law enforcement. That's butchery. Jake stopped walking, standing now 15 feet from the trembling giant who had terrorized Martha and destroyed her workplace for no reason beyond cruel entertainment. Lightning flashed outside the windows, and thunder rolled across the sky like artillery fire from some distant battlefield. 47 confirmed kills, Jake corrected mildly. All justified under federal law. All documented and investigated by territorial authorities. All men who chose violence over surrender when given the opportunity to walk away. His pale blue eyes seemed to look through Crane rather than at him, seeing not just the sweating, frightened bully but the pattern he represented. The type that appeared in every frontier town and mining camp, feeding on fear like parasites feeding on blood, growing strong by making others weak. James Parker in Abilene, Jake continued, his voice taking on the cadence of a man reciting a familiar litany. Shot a shop owner for refusing to extend credit, then killed the man's 12-year-old son when he tried to protect his father's body. Given 3 chances to surrender. Chose to fight. The memory was clear as yesterday despite the passage of time. Parker's face twisted with cruel laughter as he stepped over the boy's body, his smoking gun already swinging toward Jake's position behind the Mercantile's loading dock. The shot that ended Parker's life had been quick and clean, but Jake still remembered the weight of the boy's body when he carried it to the undertaker. Samuel Cross in Dodge City, Jake continued, his voice never changing tone or inflection. Burned down a church with the congregation inside because the preacher had spoken out against his gambling operation. 15 people died, including 6 children. Given 2 chances to surrender. Chose to fight. Cross had been faster than most, his draw smooth and practiced, but speed meant nothing when your opponent had already calculated where you would be before you started moving. The bullet had taken him center mass, and he had died with his unfired revolver still clutched in his hand. Thomas Wade in Tombstone, Jake said, continuing his recitation of names and crimes that stretched back across decades of violence and justice. Kidnapped and murdered 3 young women because their families couldn't pay his ransom demands. Tortured them for days before killing them. Given 1 chance to surrender. Chose to fight. Crane's face had gone white as paper as he listened to this catalog of evil and retribution. Each name a reminder that Jake Morrison had spent 3 decades hunting the worst of humanity and bringing them to the only justice they understood. These weren't random killings or acts of violence for personal gain. They were surgical removals of cancer from the body of civilization. performed by a man who understood that sometimes mercy was simply another form of cruelty. The rain outside intensified, and somewhere in the distance a dog began howling mournfully. The sound seemed to encapsulate the loneliness and burden of a man who had been forced to become death's accountant, keeping careful records of evil eliminated and innocent lives protected. Each man I killed was given a choice, Jake repeated, his pale blue eyes focusing once again on Crane's sweating face. Walk away or face the consequences. The same choice I'm offering you right now, Tobias. Walk away. Leave this territory. Never come back. Find an honest trade and live an honest life. Crane's breathing came in ragged gasps as he struggled with the decision that would determine whether he lived to see another sunrise. Pride warred with survival instinct. Reputation battled against wisdom, and the outcome would be written in gunpowder and lead within the next few heartbeats. What's it going to be, Tobias? Jake asked quietly. Wisdom or pride? The silence that followed Jake's question stretched between the two men like a taut wire, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder rolling across the Black Hills. Crane stood frozen in the center of Murphy's saloon, his massive frame trembling as he wrestled with the most important decision of his life. In the pale lamplight, sweat glistened on his forehead like morning dew, and his breathing came in short, ragged gasps that spoke of a man pushed beyond his limits. Every instinct screamed at him to take the offered escape, to gather what remained of his gang and disappear into the vast wilderness of the Dakota Territory where Jake Morrison's reputation might not follow. But pride was a poison that had infected Crane's soul for too many years to be easily purged. He had built his entire identity on being the most feared man in any room he entered, on watching other people step aside when he approached, on the weight of his reputation clearing obstacles that lesser men struggled to overcome. To walk away now, in front of witnesses, would destroy everything he had worked to build. Jake waited with the infinite patience of someone who had played this scene dozens of times across 3 decades of federal service. He could see the war raging behind Crane's eyes, could read the desperate calculations of a man trying to find a third option where none existed. It was always the same with men like this. The moment when they realized that reputation meant nothing in the face of genuine skill, and that intimidation was useless against someone who had looked death in the face so many times they considered it an old acquaintance. The legendary marshal's thoughts drifted to Sarah, as they always did in moments like this. She had been sitting on the porch of their cabin in Colorado when he left that morning, her silver hair catching the early sunlight as she worked on the quilt she had been making for their neighbor's new baby. Her last words to him had been a gentle reminder to pick up supplies in town, delivered with the same loving smile that had sustained him through 30 years of hunting dangerous men. Sarah Morrison had understood the weight her husband carried, the burden of necessary violence that accumulated in a man's soul like sediment in a riverbed. She had never asked him to stop doing his duty, never complained about the late nights when he sat staring into the fire and wrestling with the ghosts of men he had killed in the service of justice. Instead, she had simply loved him through it all, providing the anchor that kept him from drifting into the darkness that claimed so many men who made a living with their guns. Her death from pneumonia the previous winter had left a hole in Jake's heart that all the peaceful retirement in the world couldn't fill. He had thought that hanging up his badge and leaving the violence behind would somehow honor her memory, would transform him into the gentle man she had always seen beneath the legendary marshal's reputation. But men like Crane made such transformations impossible. They preyed on people like Martha, spreading fear and suffering like a disease that infected entire communities. Someone had to stand against them. And if that someone happened to be a tired old man who just wanted to tend his horses and read his books in peace, well, duty didn't ask permission before making its demands. I can't, Crane finally whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm outside. I can't just walk away. Too many people know what happened here. If word gets out that I backed down from one old man, I'm finished. Jake nodded slowly, as if Crane had simply confirmed something he had already known. Pride, he said quietly. It's killed more men than cholera and consumption combined. Sarah used to say that pride was just fear wearing fancy clothes, and she was right about most things. The mention of his wife's name brought a brief softness to Jake's pale blue eyes, a momentary glimpse of the man he had been when no one was looking. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the cold professionalism that had kept him alive through countless encounters with men who chose violence over wisdom. Crane's hand moved slowly toward his gun, the gesture clumsy with fear and desperate determination. His fingers trembled as they approached the walnut grip of his Colt, and Jake could see the exact moment when the big man committed himself to a course of action that would end only one way. The thing about fast draws, Jake said conversationally, his own hands hanging loose at his sides, is that most people think it's about speed. It's not. It's about timing and precision and reading your opponent well enough to know what he's going to do before he does it. As he spoke, Jake's mind performed the same calculations that had kept him alive through 30 years of similar confrontations. Crane was big and strong, but his movements were telegraphed by fear and desperation. His draw would be clumsy, powered by panic rather than practiced skill, and his aim would suffer from the adrenaline coursing through his system. Most importantly, Crane was operating from emotion rather than logic, letting anger and wounded pride cloud his judgment in ways that experienced gunfighters learned to avoid. It was the kind of fundamental mistake that separated professionals from amateurs, and Jake had built his reputation on exploiting exactly these kinds of errors. "I gave you a choice, Tobias," Jake said, his voice carrying the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "You chose poorly." Crane's gun cleared leather with desperate speed, his massive arm muscles bunching as he tried to bring the weapon to bear on his target. For a brief moment, he thought he might actually succeed, that size and determination could overcome skill and experience through sheer force of will. Jake's response was poetry written in gunpowder and lead, a demonstration of skills honed through decades of practice and refined in the crucible of life-and-death encounters. His right hand moved with liquid grace, the legendary peacemaker appearing in his grip as if conjured by magic, the hammer falling with mechanical precision that spoke of 10,000 hours of practice. The shot echoed through the saloon like thunder, but Jake was already moving, his body flowing with the deadly grace of someone who had turned violence into an art form. Crane's weapon discharged a fraction of a second later, but the big man was already falling backward, his aim spoiled by the shock of Jake's bullet finding its mark with surgical precision. The legendary Marshal's second shot followed so quickly that it seemed like an echo of the first, ensuring that Crane would never again threaten innocent people or spread fear through frontier communities. It was clean and professional, the kind of precise shooting that had made Jake Morrison a legend among lawmen and outlaws alike. Crane hit the floor with a sound like falling timber, his gun skittering across the sawdust to come to rest near the overturned poker table. His eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling with the blank expression of a man who had discovered too late that reputation was no match for genuine skill. Jake stood perfectly still for a long moment, his pale blue eyes studying the fallen giant with the clinical attention of a doctor confirming a diagnosis. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no triumph or vindication. Only the weary acceptance of a man who had been forced to return to work he had hoped never to practice again. The saloon filled with gun smoke and the acrid smell of burned powder, but the violence was over as suddenly as it had begun. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Deadwood, but inside Murphy's saloon an unnatural quiet had settled over the scene like a burial shroud. Martha emerged from her corner on trembling legs, her face pale, but her eyes bright with tears of relief and gratitude. She approached Jake slowly, as if afraid that sudden movement might shatter the peace that had been purchased with violence. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. "Thank you for protecting me." Jake holstered his weapons with the same fluid motion that had drawn them, his movements automatic and practiced. "No need for thanks, ma'am," he replied quietly. "Just doing what needed to be done." But even as he spoke the words, Jake felt the familiar weight settling back onto his shoulders, the burden of necessary violence that he had hoped to leave behind in Colorado. Another name to add to the list, another ghost to haunt his dreams, another reminder that peace was a luxury that good men couldn't always afford. Deputy Vernon Blackwood approached slowly, his own weapon still holstered and his face showing a mixture of awe and professional respect. "Marshal Morrison," he said formally, his voice carrying the reverence due to a living legend. "Just Jake," the old man corrected wearily. "I haven't carried a badge for 10 years, and I have no intention of picking one up again." He walked to the window and stared out at the storm-lashed streets of Deadwood, his reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked glass. Somewhere out there, Pike and the surviving gang members were probably fleeing into the night, carrying word of what had happened in Murphy's saloon. By morning, the story would be spreading through the territory, growing with each telling until fact became legend and legend became myth. The storm's fury seemed to be weakening, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady rhythm that would wash the blood from the streets and leave Deadwood cleaner than it had been before Crane's arrival. But Jake knew that other storms would come, other men like Crane would threaten innocent people, and someone would have to stand against them. The thought brought him no comfort as he prepared to face the long journey back to Colorado and the empty cabin where Sarah's memory waited patiently for his return. Some men were born to be peacemakers, but the peace they made was always for others, never for themselves. 3 days after the storm, Deadwood awakened to a morning so clear and bright that the previous night's violence seemed like something from a half-remembered nightmare. The sun painted the muddy streets in shades of gold and amber, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. It was the kind of morning that made people believe in second chances and fresh starts. Inside Murphy's saloon, the sound of hammers and saws filled the air as local carpenters worked to repair the damage from Crane's rampage. New tables had been ordered from the furniture maker on Main Street, and the mirror behind the bar was being replaced with one that bore no cracks or bullet holes to remind patrons of recent unpleasantness. Martha Hendricks moved among the workers with renewed purpose, her step lighter than it had been in months. The fear that had haunted her eyes for so long had been replaced by something approaching peace, and she hummed softly as she swept sawdust and wood shavings from the freshly scrubbed floor. Jake Morrison sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the rebuilding process with the detached interest of someone who understood that healing took time. He had remained in Deadwood longer than intended, partly because Deputy Blackwood had requested his assistance with the official reports, but mostly because something kept him from mounting his horse and riding back to the empty cabin in Colorado. The past 3 days had been a study in contrasts. Word of the confrontation had spread through the territory with the speed of wildfire, bringing curious visitors and reporters from as far away as Denver. Jake had avoided most of them, preferring the quiet corners of Murphy's saloon to the attention that followed him wherever the legend of Winter Morrison cast its shadow. But the attention had brought unexpected benefits. Crane's surviving gang members had been spotted fleeing toward the Wyoming border, their taste for violence apparently cured by witnessing their leader's fate. Other troublemakers who had been making life difficult for Deadwood citizens had mysteriously decided that business elsewhere required their immediate attention. The town was healing, but Jake remained haunted by the weight of choices made and roads taken. 48 confirmed kills now, instead of 47. Another name added to a list he had hoped never to extend again. Another ghost to join the collection that visited his dreams on quiet nights when the wind whispered through the mountain pines. Deputy Vernon Blackwood approached the table with 2 cups of coffee and the careful respect due to a living legend. "Mind if I join you, Marshal Morrison?" he asked formally. "Just Jake," the older man replied, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. "And you're welcome to sit, though I suspect you have questions that might be better left unasked." Vernon settled into his chair and studied the weathered face of the man who had single-handedly cleaned up Deadwood in the space of one violent evening. The official reports were complete, the witnesses interviewed, the legal formalities satisfied. But questions remained that had nothing to do with territorial law and everything to do with the burden that came with wearing a badge in frontier country. "How do you live with it?" Vernon asked quietly. "The killing, I mean. How do you sleep at night knowing you've taken so many lives, even when they deserved it?" Jake sipped his coffee slowly, considering the question that had haunted him for 30 years of federal service. It was the same question Sarah had asked him once, early in their marriage, when nightmares had awakened him from fitful sleep and left him staring into the darkness until dawn. "You don't live with it," Jake replied eventually. "You live alongside it. Like sharing a house with a wolf that you've taught not to bite, but can never fully trust." The men I've killed chose their paths just as surely as I chose mine. The difference is that my choices were made to protect innocent people, while theirs were made to harm them." He paused, watching Martha direct the placement of a new table near the window where morning sunlight could warm the wood. She had thanked him again that morning, pressing a freshly baked apple pie into his hands despite his protests. It was the kind of simple kindness that made the weight of necessary violence feel slightly more bearable. "The hardest part isn't the killing," Jake continued. "It's coming home afterward and pretending to be the same man you were before you pulled the trigger. My wife Sarah understood that better than anyone. She never asked me to stop doing my duty, never complained about the darkness I brought into our home. She just loved me through it all and helped me remember who I was when no one was looking." Vernon nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in words spoken by someone who had walked the difficult path between justice and vengeance for longer than most men survived. The young deputy had been wrestling with similar questions since pinning on his badge, wondering how many times he would be forced to draw his weapon in service of law and order. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Mayor Cornelius Whitmore, a portly man in his 60s who had been trying to speak with Jake for 3 days running. He approached the table with the nervous energy of someone delivering important news that might not be well received. "Marshal Morrison," the mayor began formally, "I hope I'm not intruding, but the town council has reached a decision regarding your actions earlier this week." Jake looked up with barely concealed weariness, recognizing the tone of voice that usually preceded offers of reward or public recognition. Both were complications he preferred to avoid, relics of a life he had tried to leave behind in Colorado. "We know you're officially retired," Mayor Whitmore continued, his voice gaining confidence as he spoke, "but we'd like to offer you a permanent position as our town marshal. The salary would be generous, and you'd have full authority to maintain peace and order as you see fit." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, representing everything Jake had walked away from when he hung up his federal badge. The chance to return to work he understood, to use skills that set him apart from ordinary men, to make a difference in the lives of people who needed protection from predators like Crane. But it also represented a return to the darkness that had nearly consumed him before Sarah's love had pulled him back from the edge. The sleepless nights, the constant vigilance, the weight of decisions that measured human lives against abstract concepts of justice and law. "I appreciate the offer," Jake replied quietly, his pale blue eyes meeting the mayor's hopeful gaze. "But I gave up that life for good reasons. What happened here was necessary, but it doesn't mean I want to make a career out of it again." The mayor's face fell with disappointment, but he nodded with the understanding of a man who had lived long enough to recognize when arguments would be futile. The town council had hoped, but they had also expected this response from a legend who had chosen retirement over glory. "Well," Mayor Whitmore said, straightening his vest with obvious reluctance, "the offer stands permanently, should you ever change your mind. And we'd like to arrange a small ceremony to honor your service to our community." "No ceremonies," Jake replied firmly. "No speeches or plaques or public recognition. What I did here was just a man protecting his neighbors. Nothing more, nothing less." After the mayor departed, Jake finished his coffee in contemplative silence, while Vernon completed his patrol reports. Outside the window, life in Deadwood continued its steady rhythm, unmarked by the violence that had visited their community like a passing thunderstorm. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, Jake made his decision. He would leave tomorrow morning, returning to the cabin in Colorado where Sarah's memory waited patiently for his return. There were horses to tend and books to read, and the difficult work of finding peace in a world that seemed determined to deny it to men like him. But first, he had one more duty to perform. He retrieved writing materials from the hotel clerk and composed a letter that would be mailed to the territorial capital, informing federal authorities that the Crane Gang was no longer a threat to law-abiding citizens. It was the kind of bureaucratic necessity that had always frustrated him about government service, but it would ensure that other lawmen didn't waste time hunting dead men. That evening, as purple shadows gathered in the canyons surrounding Deadwood, Jake sat on the hotel porch and watched the sun disappear behind the western mountains. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called mournfully to its pack. Deputy Blackwood approached with a final question. one that had been weighing on his mind since witnessing the confrontation in Murphy's saloon. "Do you think what we do makes any real difference?" he asked quietly. "There's always another Crane, another gang of killers ready to prey on innocent people. Sometimes it feels like we're just postponing the inevitable." Jake considered the question while watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. It was the same doubt that had haunted him throughout 30 years of federal service. The nagging suspicion that violence only begot more violence, and that justice was nothing more than a comforting fiction told by civilized societies. "Every person we protect matters," Jake replied eventually. "Every child who grows up without fear, every family that sleeps safely in their beds, every community that can build something good without looking over their shoulders. We can't save everyone, but we can save someone, and that has to be enough." The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate crystal patterns. Jake packed his few belongings and saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Prophet who had carried him faithfully through Colorado's mountain trails. Martha insisted on preparing a final breakfast, pressing enough supplies for a week's journey into his saddlebags despite his protests. The people of Deadwood gathered to see him off, not in formal ceremony, but in the quiet way that frontier communities honored those who had stood between them and darkness. As Jake rode out of town, he carried with him the knowledge that his brief return to violence had protected innocent people and eliminated a threat to civilized society. But he also carried the weight of another life taken, another name added to the list that would follow him to his grave. The journey back to Colorado took 5 days through mountain passes painted in autumn colors. Each mile brought him closer to the cabin where he had tried to build a peaceful life with Sarah, where her presence still lingered in every room despite the months that had passed since her death. On the final day of his journey, Jake stopped at the small cemetery where Sarah Morrison rested beneath a simple granite headstone. He knelt beside her grave and spoke quietly about the choices he had made in Deadwood, about the violence that had called him back despite his best efforts to leave it behind. The wind whispered through the pine trees overhead, and for a moment Jake could almost hear Sarah's voice reminding him that good men sometimes had to do hard things to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. She had always understood the burden he carried, the weight of necessary violence that accumulated in a man's soul like sediment in a riverbed. As evening shadows gathered around the cemetery, Jake made his peace with the past and prepared to face whatever future awaited a man who had become a legend by doing what others couldn't or wouldn't do. The work was never finished, the fight never completely won, but sometimes that was the price of being someone who stood between the innocent and those who would do them harm. If you've enjoyed this tale of frontier justice and the weight of doing what's right when no one else will, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We bring you stories of courage, sacrifice, and the price of peace every week, tales that remind us what it truly means to stand for something greater than ourselves. Until next time, may you have the courage to do what's right when the moment calls for it, and the wisdom to know when that moment has arrived.